Well, I'm just back from the US after 2 weeks seeing my family. So there's a little bit of jet lag here, but I've got my coffee. I'm ready to go. My interest in geopolitics started with the Arab Spring because there were certain things that were happening in the news that were not making sense if you apply one's common sense. And I started reading independent news sources, foreign news sources, and once you start doing that and getting outside the Western narrative, as we call it, uh, you start to see a very different picture of world affairs. Now, having grown up in the U.S., I lived there for the first 37 years of my life. The one thing that Americans experience from the day of their birth is a heavy indoctrination in American politics and American exceptionalism. And I was born during the golden period of the United States, just after World War II. I was born in the mid-50s. So I experienced the U.S. in its prime as an industrial power, as one of the two major powers in the world, along with Russia. And what we see emerging in the world today is this struggle for unification between the two Aquarian souls, the U.S. and the Russians. After moving to Australia, it became clear that what I was hearing in the U.S. news and in the media in general, press and all that, was not exactly as it was. And thanks to channels in Australia like the SBS, the subtitle broadcasting system, as we like to call it, the wider world began to come into view. So we start this presentation with a few questions, and the presentation here will be based in fact, not on opinion. Now, if I express an opinion, I'll say so, whether mine or someone else's. But I'll start the share screen here and we'll get started. Here we are. Okay, can we move this? Yeah, we can move this out of the way. Okay, is all this clear? I'm assuming it is.
Yes, Malvin, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, you can go to read screen, read view if you want to.
Sorry, say again.
You go to read view. Mikhail, maybe you have to point that out to you.
Yeah, I don't know if you're wanting to run it in the edit mode, or do you want us to just see the slide? Which one?
Just the slide.
If you go to the bottom right, where the zoom, where it says 80%, click the icon that is to the second one from 80%.
Okay.
So go to 80% and go left. No, that's zoom. Not that one, that one.
Okay.
Just,
yeah, I'm kind of new to all this too. Okay, here we go.
Yep, we got you.
That's great.
Okay, so as Philip was saying before, Europe is the field for the education of the world and the ideas of a true world unity and for the wise presentation of the plan. From that continent can the inspiration go forth to the east and the west. That was written more than 70 years ago. So, but we have certain questions arising from that. From the title page, just read, arise a few questions. Firstly, in our present historical moment, what kind of example is Europe setting for the world? We have one perspective in the West, and we'll see what the West is in a few minutes. And the global south, or the developing world, or the world outside the West, has a very different opinion. Secondly, who's educating whom in the ideas of true world unity and the wise presentation of the plan? Now we're talking in this present historical moment. Of course, the Western narrative is that it's all about freedom, democracy, human rights, and so forth. Whereas the two major powers outside the U.S., that is Russia and China, are saying that, yeah, we need to adhere to the international law as put forward by the UN. In other words, more towards the four freedoms of Roosevelt. And thirdly, we ask the question, what is actually meant by Europe? So this is a matter of perspective. Going forward through this, we look at the importance of cycles, the importance of geography, the importance of cultures, the importance of history. In this presentation, we won't be covering history so much. I'll do that in the second talk because it ties in with Europe and the multipolar world. But we'll also look at the astrological connections, the ray connections, and ask the question, are we looking at Europe as a supranational federation or as a series of blocks? So turning to the rays, this is from Bailey Esoteric Psychology, page 26. The four rays of manifestation at the moment are 2, 3, 5, and 7. And it's worth noting that these, of course, are all lesser cycles, ray cycles within the influence of the sign of Pisces. You'll see that four rays are in manifestation at this time. Okay. There's another cycle we need to consider, and it's the one that's playing on the world in these present years, especially from 2015. From Blavatsky and the Theosophists back in 1880, if we divide the world, the map of the old world into 5 parts into Eastern, Central, and Western Asia, Eastern and Western Europe, and Egypt, then we'll easily perceive that every 250 years, an enormous wave passes over these areas, bringing into each, in its turn, the events that is brought to the one next preceding. This wave we may call the historical wave of the 250-year cycle. Now this is the fourth ray cycle, and it's a lesser cycle of the larger fourth ray cycle, which begins to come in 2025. The reader will please follow this mystical number of years, so on and so forth. There are 2 links here where this quote is expanded in full. So is this Europe? Well, this map comes from Great Britain, and we notice certain things are missing. We don't see Turkey, for instance. There's a small part of Turkey that's in Europe across the Bosporus. We don't see Crimea. We don't see Russia. There's a reason for this, and it goes to the European elites who have wanted to cancel Russia for a long time. We'll get to the reasons why shortly. If we go further, this is a map of continental Europe, which stretches from the Ural Mountains over to Iceland and to Great Britain, furthest to the west. Then we have the European nations, and Russia is listed as a European nation. Sometimes you'll see Turkey listed as a European nation because this small part of it here is actually in Europe. And in fact, Turkish society is more Western than it is Asian. And that's problematic too, because Turkey is also part of NATO, which is an American construct, and it's causing particular angst in Washington at the moment because Turkey is actually looking toward Asia and saying, okay, that's where the resources are, that's where the growth is. Now, European Russia covers the vast majority of Eastern Europe and spans roughly 40% of Europe's total landmass, with over 15% of its total population. So if we try to exclude Russia, we're excluding that much of Russia from Europe and European culture, and you cannot really divorce Russia from the evolution of Europe because it's been part and parcel of that for many centuries. European Russia accounts for about 75% of Russia's total population. So most of Russia is European, is Western leaning. It covers an area of about 4 million square kilometers or 1.5 million square miles. You can read this a bit later. All 3 federal cities of Russia lie within European Russia. These cities are Moscow, the nation's capital and largest city, which is the 2nd most populous city in Europe. Interesting. St. Petersburg, the cultural capital and the 2nd most populous city in the country, and Sevastopol, located in Crimea. Crimea has been historically Russian and Russian-speaking, regardless of present historical arguments. The historical population of European Russia was composed of Slavic, Finnic, Germanic, Turkic, Jewish, North Caucasian, Baltic, Khazarian, and Norse peoples. So it's an important center, a very important country. And if we look at European cultures, we get an even more diverse picture. But we see that there's a large area of Europe, continental Europe, that is Slavic. You have Eastern Slavs, Southern Slavs in the Balkans, and Western Slavs in Poland and the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic regions. This has been a fruitful source of trouble throughout history, especially in European history. And this is Slavic Europe, giving a better picture. So we see that Belarus is a mixture of the Eastern Slavic and the Western Slavic, as well as what used to be called Novorossiya and Crimea. So what's actually happening here? This is a picture that scares Washington half to death. This is what we'd have if there were not the present conflicts and the conflicts over the last century. We would have Eurussia, with Russia linking Asia and Europe, the Russian motto being "I link 2 ways." Pausing here a bit, the 250-year cycle that was mentioned earlier is coming to a close. Now, the last close was in 1775, thereabouts, and saw the beginning of the rise of the Anglo-American Empire. We can justifiably call it an empire because it's been the major power base in the world for about 250 years, starting with England and then with the United States after World War II. But in 1775, we had the beginnings of the American Revolution. And as a result of that revolution, it caused a wave of revolutions to sweep across Europe, sweeping away ancient monarchies. And in fact, there are very few monarchies left in Europe at all. So what we have with this 250-year cycle, it also roughly corresponds to the orbital cycle of Pluto. which is about 247 years. And with Pluto having just peaked into Aquarius, it's highlighting the two main Aquarian sols, the U.S. and Russia, which is what the current conflict is actually about. I'll be covering that more in the second talk. But essentially what's happening is the wave of influence from this 250-year cycle is leaving the West and it's moving east. I've heard it said in several commentaries that it feels like the rug is being pulled out from under the West. And this is exactly why, because if we look at the subjective energy of this 250-year cycle, it reached its peak around 1900, which is when the U.S. emerged as a world power. It also began the decline of the European powers, starting with the First World War, which was actually instigated by the financiers in New York, Washington, and London, which forms a major materialistic triangle. That has affected Europe very strongly, but what's happening at the moment is the American hegemony is collapsing because the subjective force has been withdrawn. And it's said that, I don't have the quote in front of me, but by 2050, China will be at its peak in terms of spiritual development. And we see the rise of China at the moment. Now, the reason China is seen as a threat is not because it's a military threat, but because it represents a threat to the financial model of the U.S. and the City of London, which is financial capitalism. We know it by several names: financial capitalism, free market capitalism, neoliberal capitalism. It's not based in industry, it's based in services. And this is why we're having so much trouble feeding all the military aid into Ukraine at the moment, because we've moved all our industry offshore. Again, I'll cover that in the second talk. Now, moving on to the influences, the Aquarian part of Europe is shown by these lines here. All these maps, everything I'm showing you here will be made available, so you can blow up these maps at your leisure later. The soul influence is indicated by the circled regions. I didn't circle the United States, but basically you have this push-pull between the United States and Russia, and to a lesser extent in the Netherlands. This is what's being worked out at a personality level, which we'll see in a minute. The other influences, the Aquarian personalities, are in Switzerland, in Moscow, and yeah, I think that's it. The reflex, the opposite sign, we see in Leo. And this is an important consideration because the opposite signs reflect each other, reflect back upon each other. And we see that there is a very strong Leo influence in Europe. The soul influences are shown in the red triangle, and the personality influences are shown in the orange. What we see primarily is the relationship between Berlin, London, and Rome, influencing Western Europe. We see soul influence that is barely seeking to come out in Romania. We see the Leo soul of Italy trying to express itself, but it's under the heavy heavy American influence at the moment, as shown in its government. And the city of London and London proper, we should note that there are two distinct differences between the city of London and Metro London. The city of London is the financial capital. It's like a state within a state, a bit like the Vatican in Italy. But it has had overriding control over Western finance for many centuries. This is at the heart of the special relationship, as it's called, between the United States and Great Britain. It's also at the beating heart of the capitalist system, which Russia and China are seeking to offset. It's important to note they're not seeking to do away with it. They're just seeking to lessen the influence of it so that lesser states, less powerful states can emerge and become sovereign, which is an Aquarian ideal. Gemini in Europe is also interesting because it's the personality of the United States. It's also in England and Belgium and Poland. And these are the major belligerents regarding Russia at the moment. Then we have the opposite sign, Sagittarian Europe. Sagittarius is the personality sign of Washington. The soul influence is in Brussels and Spain, and it's the personality of Italy. So Italy and the US have always been very closely connected. Then we have the West. This is all to give background for what's to come, and you'll hear much commentary over the next 4 days regarding these matters, but it's important we keep these things in mind. The West is primarily influenced by Washington, Great Britain, and through the EU. Then we also have Australia and New Zealand, and to a lesser extent, South Africa, which was settled by the Dutch and the British, if memory serves. We also see there's a slight coloring of the West in Russia, also in Ukraine and Belarus. Then we have the Anglosphere, which is the primary influence over Europe at the moment. Now, what we have, going back to the 1775 and the start of the 250-year cycle, the rise of the West, or the Anglo-American Empire. This is where idealism was born. It was born out of the French Revolution. France having the fifth ray soul and the third ray personality. It gave very diverse views on a number of matters, but when we talk about ideals, we're talking about something that's, or idealism, we're talking about something that's more or less uniquely Western. Now, it's taken over much of the world, but its primary focal point has been in the West and in France. If we go back to the Leo influence, we see this very strongly in the personality of France. My father was a Leo, for instance, and some of his favorite sayings were like, when he walked into a room, he'd say, "Here I am, all you lucky people." When he'd leave the room, he would say, "Glad you got to see me." I worked with a fellow, another Leo, whose favorite saying was, "It's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way." Well, we've heard this sort of ideal or this sort of opinion expressed recently by Josep Borrell, the chief diplomat for the EU, who called Europe a garden. And the world outside of Europe was like a jungle seeking to invade the garden. This is just exceptional as claptrap. We also heard it in Barack Obama in the US, who called the US the one indispensable nation. The rest of the world would just like to see the US become like a normal country again. So we're having to go over these things very quickly, but it's important for our background once again. Western Europe, this is the political division of Western Europe, primarily set up and controlled via Washington and London through the financial capitalism. This was set up primarily after World War II through the Marshall Plan. I'll be posting some links and articles toward the next talk, which explains a lot of this. And some of these things will seem conspiratorial or fantastic to some listeners, but the people who have studied the history, the context, the influences, especially the financial influences, all this is clear enough. And then we have the EU, which is basically Western Europe minus the UK at the moment, and with much of Central Europe. Now we note that the Western Europe is not primarily Slavic, but with the inclusion of these other nations in Central Europe, we get the Slavic influence. And this has been used as a sort of cudgel against Russia for a number of years. The CIA started setting up and promoting the nationalism in Ukraine, for instance, and in Poland just after World War II. There's a document from the 1950s that spells it out very clearly. And this is cast a black cloud over what is happening in Ukraine and with the war between what is essentially the Russians and NATO at present. If we look at Russia in terms of its land mass, we see it's basically the size of South America. If we place the United States, it takes up 2 of the US to make up 1 of Russia. It's important to consider this because the European and American elites for a long time have wanted to break up Russia because they think it's just too big, you know. They don't deserve all that land mass. They should be sharing their resources with us. Well, essentially, the Russians have tried to share their resources. But the problem is the Western powers want to control those resources, and the Russians are saying no. You know, the Leo personality puts the foot down and says, Russia's our land. You'll play by win-win rules, or we won't play with you. And a lot of this comes from Atlantean culture, because the rim of old Atlantis is along the eastern seaboard of the US and Western Europe. And we had the following: the heights of luxury were reached in Atlantis, of which we, with all our boasted civilization, know nothing and have never achieved. Some faint traces of it have come to us from the legends from Eastern Egypt, from our archaeological discovery and old fairy tales. There was a recurrence of the pure Atlantean mischief and wickedness in the decadent days of the Roman Empire. Life became tainted by the miasma of unadulterated selfishness, and the very springs of life itself became polluted. Man only lived and breathed in order to be in possession of the utmost luxury and of a very plethora of things of material goods. They were smothered by desire, plagued by the dream of never dying, but of living on and on, acquiring more and more of all that they desired. And this sounds very much like the elitist and oligarchic structures we have in the West today. In terms of the rays, I won't go too much into this, but we note that there is not a first ray soul in Europe, except maybe as it comes through Geneva. But it doesn't come through the nations. It's related to China and India via Germany and Great Britain. Ray 2 comes into Europe via the US and the UK, not in the European personality except via Geneva. Ray 3 exists in Europe only in the French personality, but which links it to China.
Hi, my name is Irina. I have a question about Russian positioning of the Moscow as what I picked up from your presentation, that the Moscow is the chosen, so to speak, center of Russia that is being a focus in this presentation as I understood. Of course, Moscow is geopolitical center, and but I'm a bit confused. Is Moscow considered also a spiritual center of Russia? Because myself being Russian, being born there and lived there major part of my life, that's from the perspective of Russian people, might be for some true and for some maybe not. So I just want your opinion on that, and how do you discern, and what is actually Moscow regarded in your presentation? Is it geopolitical center or spiritual?
Okay, it's more the geopolitical center, and in the Destiny of the Nations by Alice Bailey, the Tibetan lists the rays and the signs of many of the world capitals. It would be more a geopolitical center. It's more difficult to decide where the soul of a nation actually resides. To my opinion, the soul of a nation resides in its people. It's across a nation. And the people will influence the government in times of challenge, in terms of public opinion, like in our democracies, so-called. Public opinion will influence the politics of a nation, but it'll be colored by the actual rays and signs of the capital itself. Washington being a good example. Now, being an American, I can tell you that the soul of the U.S. does not reside in Washington. Washington is the elitist center, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the soul center. I would see the soul of the U.S. in all the 50 states. You can find it everywhere. So I hope that clarifies a bit. St. Petersburg would be approaching more a spiritual center for Russia, I would say, as it represents art and the higher expression of humanity. I'm sure the other Russian presenters will expand on that point.
Malvin, yes, thanks for that quote about Atlantis and Western Europe and Eastern United States being part of that landmass or some of those Atlantean continents. I think it was a really good point, because this is exactly what's happening with the elites today. It's pure Atlantean mischief and stupidity, as DK calls it. Of course, we know that World War I and II were a recapitulation of the Atlantean conflict. So we are still kind of dragging ourselves out of our Atlantean past at the moment.
Yeah, I would say that's the case. Essentially, nothing is going to change in Europe so long as the elitist technocratic factions is still in power. And that's another thing the present conflict in Ukraine has highlighted, because the elites are trying to push back on Russia, but the people here in Europe don't want it. You know, they don't want to send all this weaponry to Russia. They just, I mean, to Ukraine. They just want the war to end and to have peaceful relations. And in fact, many European nations had good relations, especially business relations with Russia before this conflict actually started. So we see nations like Germany, Brussels, Washington, London, and Poland, along with the Baltic states, being very belligerent toward Russia, trying to sever Russia from Europe, so-called. And in fact, if you look at it pragmatically, especially with that map of Eurasia, it just makes sense for Europeans to have good relations with Russia. That would be the most pragmatic solution. But the sole reason NATO was set up was to keep the Americans in Europe, the Russians out, and Germany down. And that was stated by General Ismay at the founding of NATO. I'll be covering this in the second talk because it's important to consider how the EU and Europe in general moves forward at the end of this conflict, which is very likely to go on into next year. Okay, further comments or questions?
Yeah, one question, two questions actually. Kasia says, I wonder if someone knows or senses the rays of Poland, the soul and personality ones.
Yeah, that would be interesting conjecture. Of course, the Gemini through Poland appears as a third ray, but doesn't mean that it is. Capricorn is very active in Poland too, because you're dealing with a structure that's decaying and falling apart. In fact, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn signaled the end of an old order.